to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Knitpicks.com has been serving the knitting community for over 20 years and believes knitting is for everyone, which is why they work hard to make knitting accessible, affordable, and approachable. Knitpicks responsibly sources its fiber to create an extensive selection of affordable yarns like High Desert from Shaniko Wool Company. Are you looking for an ethical, eco-friendly yarn to try? Look no further than Knitpicks Eco Yarn line. Need needles? Knitpicks makes a selection for knitters right at their Vancouver, Washington headquarters. Knitpicks.com, a place for every knitter. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder, Ann Merrow. I'm here with Louie García, a Pueblo fiber artist of Tiwa and Piro heritage. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I first learned of your work in the Spin-Off article, which is on the actually in the cover of Spin-Off Summer 2020 about Pueblo cotton in the American Southwest. And there is a beautiful piece of brown cotton weaving in there. Would you tell me just a little bit about that?
Sure. The piece is actually a replica of a prehistoric Hohokam piece that comes from Ventana Cave in Arizona. And I had the privilege of visiting the collection at the Arizona State Museum in Tucson when I was doing research for another replica project of the cotton openwork shirt, the Tonto shirt, commonly known as. So while we were there, we were able to look at some of the other textiles, and this shirt, or this poncho, as it's commonly referred to as, was one of the pieces. And it was something that I was very familiar with in terms of the literature. It's commonly published in a lot of the books, or the few books dealing with Pueblo textiles. And so I was very familiar with the piece from the literature. But I was always fascinated by it because I was not familiar with the technique. So when I had the opportunity to actually look at the piece closely, and even warps and wefts, and look at the spin, the girth of the spin and whatnot, I was just awestruck and inspired, and it automatically went on my bucket list to get to at some point. And so after we finished the Sprang Openwork Shirt replica, that was a joint project between myself and another artist by the name of Carol James, who's actually a teacher of Sprang. And so our collaboration on that project, when that was completed, that's when I decided that I wanted to experiment more with other prehistoric techniques that weren't commonly practiced or that were forgotten with time. And that's how I came to do that piece. And I had just returned from a trip to Oaxaca where we got to visit some Mixtec weaving communities along the coast. And so that's where we were able to observe the women there spinning, beating cotton, the coyuche, the natural brown cotton, and spinning it with the traditional support malacate spindle. And so that had just really inspired me, and I fell in love with the natural brown, the natural colored cotton. And so I really wanted to make a unique piece. The original piece of the weft wrap openwork piece replica that I did, that's pictured on the summer issue, was actually done in white cotton, but I just really loved the natural brown, and I wanted to do a piece, and I had a bunch of balls of already spun cotton that I had already spun. So I decided to use natural brown cotton to make that replica, and so that's what I did, and I was very happy with the final result.
It's absolutely beautiful. It's interesting that you have these replica projects. What is it that makes you want to not only, spin and weave cotton, but to follow so closely the work that's in these archaeological pieces?
That's a really great question, and I as a student, I'm a Pueblo weaver, and I have been for most of my life. My grandfather. I learned the basics from my grandfather, and I kind of just took it from there. I would say for the most part, I'm pretty much self-taught. I study textiles in our family collection that we use for ceremonial use. I then started expanding to study both public and private collections, so local museums and private collections of art collectors and so on and so forth that are gracious enough to allow me into their collections to study them. As I started branching out and studying historic collections of Pueblo textiles, it just became a breadcrumb trail for me, and I started wanting to reach further and further back. Because one of the things that collectors pay very close attention to is the relative age of the textiles. Because as collectors, they know that there is more value attached to the older textiles. And for me, it's not so much the value that I was interested in, but the continuity of techniques and textiles. And so, of course, as we all know, over time, materials change in terms of textiles. Techniques of spinning, for example, change, where many of the older textiles are hand spun cotton versus commercially spun cotton twine. Naturally dyed fibers versus commercially aniline dyes, lots of those kinds of things. But as I reached further and further back, I was actually commissioned by a local museum, the Albuquerque Museum here in Albuquerque. I was commissioned to do a piece for a Tiwa Pueblo leader at the time of contact. And so I had a pretty good concept, a good handle on the historic Pueblo textiles post-contact, but I wasn't too familiar with the archaeology and the specifics of pre-contact textiles. I mean, I had a general idea, but I wanted to get it right, and I wanted to get in touch with the experts in the field, the archaeologists that definitely knew know about the prehistoric textiles. So that put me in contact. That kind of put me in contact with an archaeologist by the name of Louie Webster, who lives up in Colorado, just on the doorstep of Mesa Verde ruins out that way. And so her and I started communicating, and we met up here in Albuquerque, and I shared with her my project, the project that I had been asked to complete, and of course she shared with me her work over the years with Pueblo textiles. And one thing led to another. She shared her information with me, which definitely informed my the commission piece that I completed, and it catapulted me into a whole other direction to study in earnest the prehistoric Pueblo textiles. And she actually invited me to join her research committee on a project that she was initiating at that time called the Cedar Mesa Perishables Project. And in that project, we were tasked with documenting perishable material that came from the southeastern Utah area primarily, but generally the Four Corners region, in the various institutions where these collections now are stored. And so over the summer, because I'm a teacher by trade, that's my profession, I'm an educator. But I had summers available to go and visit these museums with her and our research team, and go through. And basically, it was just going through drawer by drawer and looking at the material, the artifacts that are in the drawers, and identifying materials, looking at techniques. And I was actually brought on as a cultural consultant along with my colleague Chris Lewis from the Pueblo of Zuni, to consult on the weaving aspects, and Chris's area of expertise is basketry and yucca working with yucca material. And so we were looking at everything from wooden tools, implements, bone awls, of course, textile and textile fragments, yucca rope and cordage, plaited basketry, plaited sandals, twine sandals, a whole gamut of material and techniques that we were looking at and identifying and photographing, which will be compiled in a catalog and made available via internet to anyone who wants to access them. So that's how I got into studying more of the prehistoric, because it was an important connection for me as a Pueblo individual. Of course, as Pueblo people, we maintain a very strong connection with our ancestral past, and it's a part of our everyday life for us. We carry our ancestors with us every time we sit down to a meal. We put food aside for them. Every time the sun comes up in the morning, we go out and offer cornmeal and greet the sun and acknowledge our ancestors that have gone before us, and so we acknowledge them. So it's a very important aspect of who we are as Pueblo people.
And now a word from our sponsors. Knitters know Manos del Uruguay for their yarn's rich tonal colors, but the story of women's empowerment and community benefit enriches every skein. Discover 17 bases from lace-weight to super bulky, made and dyed at artisan-owned cooperatives in Uruguay. Ask for Manos at your local retailer or visit FairmontFibers.com. And now back to the show. It's interesting that you talk about the Cedar Mesa Perishables Project and having to work to understand these pieces that would have probably disintegrated elsewhere. In a way, the knowledge that you're sort of recreating is perishable in its own way. It requires effort to continue it and keep it moving forward. And you do teach other weavers, is that right?
That's correct.
And I think it mentioned that you're part of a guild and you're involved in helping other people maintain these traditions. How did you become involved in that? Not only weaving for yourself, but in sharing that with other weavers.
Well, for us as Pueblo people, traditional knowledge is something that has a great deal of value. And oftentimes there is the knowledge is it's not like Western culture where it's kind of a right to know. Everyone has a right to know kind of concept. In Pueblo culture, their knowledge is respected, and there are there are cases where knowledge is only for certain groups or individuals, and that's something that's respected and acknowledged. It's part of the culture. We don't ask questions if the information, if we're not privy to certain information, we don't prod and ask questions, because if we're meant to know, then we will be taught, and we'll learn what we need to know. But for me, in terms of a traditional Pueblo artist, a traditional Pueblo weaver, I take that as a responsibility, because we are, in essence, at the service of our community and the larger Pueblo community, because we're producing textiles and clothing that are very important for ceremonial use. So we're often seeked out by individuals who need certain items for various ceremonies, because there are not very many of us, of weavers, traditional weavers, who are producing these textiles. And so because that number is so small, I saw a need for creating a means to share knowledge in a safe space among Pueblo individuals, amongst each other, to revitalize and cultivate this traditional knowledge that was being lost, and rarely practiced techniques, for example. So that's what kind of led me to creating the Pueblo Fiber Arts Guild here in New Mexico, because of that need. And it actually came out of some classes that I was doing at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center here in Albuquerque with Pueblo individuals. We were kind of brainstorming ideas of how we can, create a group or a space, a safe space for us to gather and share ideas and share techniques and history and share our work and work together as weavers, because traditionally, all of the Pueblo fiber arts activities were essentially social activities that reinforced family and clan connections and reinforced the relationships within the community, as it did long ago and historically and prehistorically. So that's how we decided to create the guild. And one of the needs that we saw was to create a marketplace, because here in New Mexico, New Mexico is pretty famous for Indian market, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, Indian art market in the world. And so New Mexico has a lot of fame for that. But we know that over the years, there are very few, maybe just a handful, if that, of Pueblo fiber artists and Pueblo weavers who are producing material for that venue. So we realized that because most of the market for Pueblo textiles is essentially Pueblo for use within, we also know that there is a growing interest in collectors of Pueblo textiles. So we wanted to create a show, a unique show by Pueblo people, for Pueblo people, to create a market and encourage the use of natural fibers and production of traditional Pueblo textiles for both the Pueblo community as well as the non-Indian community, art collectors, museums, etc. And so nothing like that has existed up to this point until we began going on 10 years ago now. And the other piece that I really wanted to integrate as an educator was the education piece, because Pueblo textiles is something that there's not a lot written about it. There's maybe a handful of books that touch on the subject, as a focus. So I wanted to create a space where people could come, both Pueblo and non-native alike, to learn about Pueblo textiles. So one of the things that we encourage at our show is for artists to demonstrate their art form and or show the materials that they use, the tools that they use, so that it becomes more of an educational experience as much as a high-end art show. And so that usually happens in the winter months in November. So it usually kind of coincides with the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. So we kind of pitch it as, kind of like a holiday shopping kind of thing, where people can purchase gifts and meet artists and learn about the Pueblo weaving tradition. So that's how that all kind of came together, because as Pueblo artists, we have a responsibility to share the knowledge with our community, among those who want to learn, because we all use these textiles. We are a living culture. We still practice our ceremonies and traditions, which all require these traditional textiles. So that is first and foremost part of our mission. And then secondly, educating the general public about this ancient tradition and sharing with all who are interested and all who want to learn about this ancient tradition that is still alive in many of our communities.
So the people who are involved in the show are probably at a fairly high level of their craft. How are people coming into this? Are there beginners joining your guild, or how are people learning to spin and weave? You mentioned that you learned it as part of your family. Is that typical?
Yes and no. In some cases, there are individuals who learn the basics from a family member or a community member. But typically, I think more so in recent years, it's become more difficult for Pueblo individuals to access a teacher. And even more so now with the world, how it is, we're all, off at school, in college, or working 9 to 5. Very few of us actually have the privilege of, being able to make a living from our work, because it's not, Pueblo weaving is not considered a fine art, if you will, like painting or maybe Pueblo pottery or jewelry, because it's such a very small audience, if you will. And so the idea there is that since most of the production of the textiles is for internal use within our communities, it's more difficult, and there are many different layers to that, because some artists are reluctant to share, especially with individuals not from their home community. And that, like I said, goes back from what I mentioned at the very beginning, to that idea that knowledge is highly valued and respected. And so a lot of times, different individuals, different communities go by different rules as to what can be shared and with whom. So we constantly have that at the forefront of, how we decide what to share with which audiences. And because we have a responsibility, I have to answer to my community, and I have to answer to my elders about anything that I publish, anything that I share within my classes. And I'm often respectfully questioned by members of the Pueblo weaving community and those individuals that I highly respect, because many of these individuals have made the Pueblo weaving their lifestyle. And I think that is the highest form that Pueblo weaving can take, because that is traditionally how weavers within the community, just like potters or people who focus on making jewelry, each craft, if you will, had its niche. And each of those craftsmen or craftswomen had an important role within the community to provide the products and the materials that were needed for use within the community. So it's not this idea of me as an individual artist. I have to answer, and I have a responsibility to the larger, to my own community, as well as the larger Pueblo community. And that's something that I take very seriously. So Pueblo individuals who approach me and ask if I would be willing to teach them, really what it comes down to is, if I have the time, because as an educator, it's very difficult to carve out time to work. And as fiber artists, we know that spinning and weaving and dyeing it's time consuming, and you have to dedicate time and carve out time to be able to practice your art form. And so that's always the tricky part. And so what I've been able to do is to offer classes in the summer. I usually offer about a month-long class. We meet, maybe for about a week, a full day, or we'll split up the meetings. And, I've been fortunate to, be provided funding and the means to be able to offer these classes through various organizations, nonprofits. The New Mexico Arts organization has been a big supporter of supporting traditional apprenticeships for individuals who want to learn from a mentor, from a master artist in the field. Various museums have gotten behind providing venues for offering these sorts of classes. And it's been both. I've had classes open to the general public, and I've had classes with groups of exclusively Pueblo individuals. And so it's all about, sharing within the context and the spirit of sharing human knowledge, because fiber arts and weaving is a human activity over history and across cultures. And so my open classes, my mixed classes, open to non-natives, are really approach it from that perspective and kind of give a very brief overview of that history, but I don't delve too much into the deeper meanings behind our textiles as I would in a Pueblo class. And so that's just in keeping with the various levels of knowledge within our traditions, Pueblo traditions.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the things I noticed about the child's poncho that you wove is that at the same time that you're being aware of and recording the traditional Pueblo techniques, you also made the choice to use a tool and cotton. I think you said it was Mixtec Malacate spindle.
Mm-hmm.
So you have things coming in from different traditions at the same time that you're very much working within the Pueblo tradition.
That's right. And actually, I think I addressed that point in my article, because as Pueblo people, we all have oral histories of how our communities came to be. And so, generally speaking, we all have migration stories about where our people originated and places that they've visited throughout. And so we know that our ancestors were instructed to travel across the landscape and settle across the landscape and leave evidence, or in essence, mark the places where we have been with evidence of our occupancy through leaving behind artifacts such as broken pottery, arrowheads, petroglyphs, dwellings, all of the pieces of our culture, and so we know that a part of that history talks about individuals or groups that visited the South and may have come from the South or originated in the South. And when I say the South, I'm talking about Mexico and Mesoamerica. And so we know through our oral tradition that various traditions, art forms, and even ceremonies come directly from the South. And even still today, in modern Pueblo culture, we still use seashells, which come from the Gulf of Mexico and the western coast of California, Baja, such as the spondyla or spiny oyster shells, the olivella shells, that come from very specific places, not from the Southwest. Materials such as cotton was introduced from Mesoamerica around 600 AD. So we do know that certain technologies, such as textiles and pottery, for example, are two examples, come directly from Mesoamerica. And so we know through our oral histories and traditions that these two specific traditions come from the South. And so we recognize those and acknowledge those and respect those traditions because they've been integrated and become very vital components of our Pueblo culture today. And so those of us who have the opportunities and the ability to communicate with Indigenous individuals of Mexico are able to go down and converse and communicate and visit communities, which is what I do because my wife is actually Nahua from the state of Morelos in Mexico, which is central Mexico. So every year, my family and I go down to visit the family. And while we're down there, I'll often travel. Me and my wife will go and travel and visit other Indigenous weaving communities from various linguistic groups, from Nahua to Tepewa to Otomi, so various different groups. And so as someone who's even slightly familiar with Indigenous cultures of Mexico, there are about 62 Indigenous language groups currently in Mexico today. And many of those groups, of course, still maintain their language, culture, and traditions. And some of them even maintain their prehistoric weaving traditions. And So the Mixtec of the coast of Oaxaca down in southernmost Mexico, are still growing natural colored cotton and spinning and preparing the cotton in the same manner that cotton was prepared for spinning in the ancestral Pueblo period, but has since been forgotten to history. But we do know through archaeological evidence that cotton beating wands have been found archaeologically that suggest that cotton was prepared in the same way that I was able to witness firsthand in this Mixtec community in Oaxaca, Mexico today. And so for me, that was a huge eye-opener and connector, and just kind of totally reinforced that connection and that oral history that we know as Pueblo people of that connection. And I don't know, what is more gratifying and to be able to see that tradition still alive and a viable life way still today in an Indigenous community. And so for me, that's a great source of inspiration. And so something that, if I can bring a piece of that back and reintroduce it into to the Pueblo weaving community, then that is what I will do. And so publishing this article through Spinoff was one of the ways that I'm reaching a larger audience and kind of sharing some of that history with a larger audience to appreciate and know about it. Because like I said, there are very few books that are out there, and even less material that is written from a Pueblo perspective, by a Pueblo person. In fact, this article is probably one of the only articles that I'm aware of that's written from a Pueblo perspective and not an outsider perspective looking in.
So let's talk about cotton. You mentioned that you grow several kinds of cotton. Are you unusual in doing that? Or I think you mentioned that had sort of stopped being grown where you are.
Yes.
What made you decide to start growing cotton again?
That's an important question, and it's kind of at the center of a lot of the work that I do. As I mentioned earlier, it was part of the breadcrumb trail for me when I started. Like most Pueblo weavers, I started learning with acrylic red heart yarn, and race spinning that, and soaking it, going through the process, and rolling it into a ball before we warp and weave. I had never worked with wool before, and never worked with anything other than commercial cotton for some of the other projects. And so when I learned about the importance of cotton, of course, raw cotton is still used in many of our Pueblo communities today for ceremonial uses, especially during the winter months. But for us as Pueblo people, the cotton represents rain clouds and our ancestors, because in essence, we believe our ancestors return as rain clouds to bring the moisture to the people so that we have a crop and food. And so it's very much a cyclical pattern that we the way we perceive it. And so that being said, there's a very big significance and importance put on cotton, and it's something that we still use. But no one that I knew of at the time was growing cotton, growing their own cotton and processing their own cotton, and much less using the cotton that they grow and spun for weaving anymore, because it was 99.9% of the Pueblo weavers today are using commercial cotton twine and acrylic yarns. And so as I started, learning more and studying collections and learning more about the tools and the processes that were used prehistorically, of course, it was a natural thing for me to explore those areas and integrate those techniques and processes into my own practice as a Pueblo fiber artist. Because for me, doing my work and following in the steps of my ancestors is very gratifying, and I feel a much closer connection with my ancestors by taking these steps. I feel like I'm following the footsteps of my ancestors when I'm planting the cotton. When as Pueblo people are an agricultural people, and so planting is a very important aspect of our traditional culture. And so there are certain protocols and certain things that go along with planting. It's not just throwing seeds in the ground and watering them and, weeding them. It's very much a spiritual process. It's there's a deeper connection there. We offer prayers from the time that we plant, even selecting the seeds before we plant. There are prayers and songs that we offer to the seeds before planting, during planting, as the plants are sprouting, as they're growing. There are things that take place through the whole process, from even harvesting and preparing the cotton. There are certain prayers and songs that go along with that. And so as I started learning, I first started planting our Pueblo short staple cotton, and I grew several crops of that. I don't have a huge area. I just cleaned out a small plot, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet in my backyard. Here I live here in the city of Albuquerque, and planted that. And that was, gave me plenty of material to work with. And I'm still using much of that material that I first started planting several years ago now. And I share it with Pueblo individuals, religious leaders in various villages, and free of charge, or will trade for certain items. And, they have raw Pueblo cotton that they can use that was grown by a Pueblo, as opposed to commercially ginned and commercially grown and harvested cotton, which is very, very different from, cotton that we grow ourselves. It's a very different quality. And, in the Pueblo way of, hand growing and hand processing everything, it's a very different end product. The fiber is amazing to work with. But at the same time, there's a lot of investment up front in cultivating, preparing it, all the prayers that go along with it to create the material. It's a joy to work with and to produce. But it takes a large commitment, and not everyone, has that sort of time and resources or space even available to do that. So, but most of us in the Pueblos, I'm often asked for seeds, if I would share seeds. And any Pueblo individual who asks me for seeds, I always give them, a Ziploc baggie full of seeds, which is plenty to plant the whole field. Because the more of us that are planting our ancestral seeds, the better. The more we have, the merrier. So slowly, I see through as a direct impact of my work that more people are becoming aware of, more of our own Pueblo people are becoming aware of the importance and of that, and sharing and exchanging seeds. Was a very important piece. So on the flip side of that, as a fiber artist in general, and of course, a cotton enthusiast, of course, colored cotton, how could you not? So that was my, one of my muses at the time, was to explore colored cotton and work with colored cotton. And when I started learning more about the some of the living traditions today, some of the indigenous groups from the coast, the southern coast of Mexico, growing natural green and natural brown colored cottons. Of course, the beautiful textiles that they produce with them was just awe-inspiring as a fiber artist first, second as an indigenous fiber artist, and third as a Pueblo fiber artist was just so beautiful that there are still indigenous people cultivating their ancestral crops and being able to apply that technology and that art form to make a living today in today's modern society and globalization and everything that our indigenous communities are up against. Because one of the things that we discovered when we recently took a cohort of Pueblo weavers down to Oaxaca, Mexico, as a part of a traditional technologies project led by a group of archaeologists. It was this cultural exchange where we had indigenous Pueblo weavers and Mixtec weavers who are living their fiber art tradition as a way of life and selling their artwork and their natural dye work from the caracol purpura, the natural mollusk purple dye, the use of cochineal, the use of indigo, hand spinning natural colored cotton, so on and so forth. Just being immersed in the community and seeing these women sit in their traditional posahuanco, which is their traditional woven skirt, on the floor, spinning their malacate in a half gourd, living and practicing this tradition in a modern day. It was just like as if we were transported back 1,000 years ago in our own community, where men, women, and children in our own communities would have been involved in some aspect of the fiber arts production. It was very, very a very powerful experience for many of us, and I wanted to bring a little piece of that back. And so the replica piece that was published in Spinoff was a product of that experience.
So you mentioned that a lot of the Pueblo weavers are currently using, commercial yarns in one way or another. Was learning to spin just part of your weaving education, or is that something that you had to seek out separately?
Both. I would say that I learned to spin on a traditional spindle because part of weaving the belts, our traditional belts, even though we're using commercial acrylic yarn, synthetic yarn, we still have to respin the yarn so that it can hold up against the natural felting of, changing the shed in a warp-faced weave. So, I had a very basic understanding of spinning, but I had never actually, for many years, spun raw fiber, much less grown or produced my own fiber. So that was something that was along the breadcrumb trail for me. And so I actually did take a class, an introductory class in spinning at one of the local yarn shops here in town. And that gave me a really good base and kind of I was able to get my feet wet, if you will, with different spinning tools, from hand spindles, support spindles, drop spindles, and then with graduating on up to different types of wheels, and different types of fibers, everything from wool to cotton and even silk. And so we got to experiment with and get our hands into all of these different fibers and experiment with different spinning techniques and learn about all that. But it was just enough to give me a taste and to kind of ignite that curiosity and that passion. And I just took it from there. And that was maybe 15, 20 years ago now, when I experienced that. And it was just a very eye-opening experience for me. And I just kind of felt like the doors to spinning were open to me. And so I walked right in and took it from there. And I think that that's a very common experience for many of us in the fiber arts world, where you just have that one experience or that one workshop or that one person that you know in your fiber arts circle that kind of shares something with you, and it just ignites a curiosity and a passion, and you just want to explore it. And so that's how it was for me. And once, I had that basic understanding of spinning and the different tools and how they're used, then that, of course, I would go back to the literature, and when we would go visit the collections, I would carefully examine the wear marks on certain tools, such as weaving battens or the spindles that were used. Because interestingly, the prehistoric Pueblo spindles that we see in the prehistoric collections are almost identical to the type of spindles that we see being used down in Mesoamerica. And that is not surprisingly, given our understanding through our oral traditions of how weaving came to be in the Southwest. And so since then, the spindle has changed to the type of spindle that was used in the historic times, around the time of contact and thereafter. So there was definitely a shift in the fiber that was being spun from very short staple cotton to wool, which was introduced by the Spanish at the time of contact. And of course, wool, as we all know, has a much longer staple, is a protein fiber, very different from a cellulose fiber, and it just behaves differently. So I think that there are links. We have everything from the very long type of malacate with the whorl closer to the bottom, more adjusted to spinning the long fibers of wool. And then we have the middle, or the link, if you will. I like to call it the link because what's commonly known as the Hopi type spindle has a much narrower shaft, and the whorl is much closer to the center as opposed to the bottom. Top center, which was very versatile and could be used to spin either cotton or wool. So it was like that transitionary period. But prior to contact, the spindles looked very different. And so the pieces of the puzzles just started coming together. And given my, at the time, basic understanding of the history and my newfound understanding of the mechanics of spinning tools and how they were adapted for specific fibers, I was able to put the pieces of the puzzle together and be able to interpret various wear patterns in some of those tools. And it was just beautiful to be able to put the pieces of the puzzle together and paint a picture and interpret the tools and the material so that people could have a greater understanding and appreciation for that history and that art form.
So we've talked a lot about things that you've learned from all sorts of different sources. What are you looking forward to learning next?
For me, it's always been about a continual process. Many times others will refer to me as a master weaver or a master spinner. But for me, I don't consider myself a master. I consider myself, spinning and weaving and fiber arts is definitely one of my passions, but I'm always learning. I'm always continuously learning, and there's always so much more to learn. I really and truly enjoy, and I'm at my center when I'm spinning fiber or when I'm at my loom, because everything else light goes away and I'm transported back, and it's just me and my loom and this creative energy that's happening in front of me as I'm working on a piece and putting my living breath and my prayers into those pieces to be able to be used in a ceremonial. So I'm essentially breathing life into my work so that it will be able to fulfill its purpose in our communities. And so it's a constant learning process. And that includes, knowledge comes with a great deal of responsibility and an obligation to share that knowledge within our Pueblo communities, because our ancestors practiced these traditions as, to fulfill a specific need and a purpose. And so many of those traditions were lost over time. And when I completed this, the piece that's on the cover of Spinoff, the summer issue, and I shared it with my mentor, Louie Webster, who's the archaeologist and Southwest perishables expert. She looked at it and her eyes got big and she said, Louie, she says it's probably been over at least 1,000 years since anyone has woven a piece like this. And so for me, that is really at the center of why I do what I do. And the research is a very important part of that, because there's no one around today who could have sat down with me and taught me that technique. But being able to see the piece in the museum and petition it and ask for permission from the piece to be my teacher, then that's what allowed me to be able to bring that back to life, if you will. And so it's very much, a responsibility. It's not about, bragging rights. It's not about money. It's not about, for me, it's that connection with my ancestral past that really feeds me and gives me a great deal of gratification that I'm able to pay my respects and pay homage to the beautiful artistry and the knowledge base of our ancestors, and be able to share even just a small snippet, a small piece, a small fragment of the ancestral knowledge that our ancestors created and carried, is really gratifying for me. So I see in my future more research, more replicas, because that's how I'm able to converse with my ancestors. And so for me, that will probably be my work until my time is done on this earth.
Thank you so much, Louie, for your time this morning, and also for sharing your beautiful work with us. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.